The plate had already gone cold when Leah appeared at the edge of the table, her thin fingers gripping the hem of her blouse as if it were the only thing holding her up. The entire hall seemed made of glass, shining, silent, too perfumed, and in the middle of all that luxury, she just looked at the nearly untouched platter and let out in a low, unadorned voice, "Can I eat your leftovers?" The question landed in the center of the table like a dropped utensil. Renato, the advisor, turned his face at once, disgust stamped on it before he even spoke. "This isn't a place for that kind of people. Get up. Leave. The space is clean." Leah didn't even blink. She just took a short step back, like someone used to hearing the door slam in her face. The smell of his expensive cologne came too strong, mixed with the warm aroma of butter, wine, and roasted meat. The contrast was nauseating. Her skin was cold, but her face burned. Her empty stomach twisted, her mouth dry. The white light of the hall seemed harder now, as if everything there was pushing her back to the street. Valentina Azevedo didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. She just raised her hand, firm, and held Renato back before he could take another step. "No one touches her." The whole table froze. Renato looked at the billionaire, not understanding if that was an order or a test. A waiter stopped halfway. Two women pretended to adjust their glasses so they wouldn't have to look at the girl. Leah remained there, still, with her small shoulders, her hair slightly damp from the street dew, her eyes down, but too alert to seem lost. Valentina tilted her head, observing not her clothes, but the way she looked at the food. "Why are you alone on the street at this hour?" Leah took just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. "Because today I didn't find a place." The answer was dry, without request, without drama, just truth. The silence that followed seemed heavier than the silverware. Renato opened his mouth, closed it. Valentina looked at the girl again, then at the plate, then at the leftovers the others had left without thinking. And it was there, in the middle of that table that was too clean, that something began to crack inside everyone. Leah pointed with her chin at the platter, almost like commenting on the weather. "There are things there that could still be served, and things stored wrong." No one answered right away. Even the chefs at the back exchanged a brief look. Valentina narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean by that?" Leah breathed deeply, as if she were choosing each word carefully so as not to waste anything. "That you throw away good food, and you do it every day." The phrase hung in the air. Renato let out a short, nervous laugh, trying to regain control. "Oh, look, now she knows about cooking." Leah raised her face for the first time. There was no challenge there, just tiredness. "I learned before I learned to go hungry." Valentina didn't look away. On the contrary, her gaze hardened in a different way, like someone realizing too late that they had just found something rare in the wrong place. And while everyone was still trying to understand what was happening, she asked the question no one at that table expected to hear. "And if I invited you to taste the whole kitchen, would you still say this is just leftovers?" Valentina didn't take her eyes off Leah for a single second. The hall remained still, but now it was a different kind of silence, as if everyone understood that something serious was being decided there, right in front of them. Renato was still trying to keep his composure, but his hand was no longer steady at his side. Leah remained small, next to that enormous table, but her gaze had changed, as if hunger had given way to an almost cutting attention. "Taste the whole kitchen," Renato let out, in a tone that mixed irony and impatience. "Valentina, this is ridiculous." She raised her hand again without looking at him. Ridiculous is wasting food and pretending it doesn't exist. The phrase hit hard. Two guests lowered their heads. One of the chefs, near the kitchen door, swallowed hard. Leah noticed all of this without showing any victory. She just stood there, feeling the weight of those people, the heat from the lights, the cold floor under the worn sole of her shoe, and a strange thing in her chest. It wasn't joy. It was distrust. She'd already seen too much attention turn into rejection in seconds. Valentina pulled the chair next to her calmly and signaled for Leah to sit. No one moved. "Sit down." Leah looked at the chair like someone looking at a door that might be open only for an instant. "Can I?" "You can." She sat down slowly, her hands still tense on her lap, as if she didn't know where to put her body now that no one was telling her to leave. Renato approached a little, indignant. "This goes against every protocol." She came from the street, Valentina. The billionaire turned her face toward him, cold enough to make the man step back half a step. "So what?" Leah lowered her eyes to the main plate, then to the platter forgotten in the center, then to the untouched wine glass. There was no astonishment on her face. There was calculation. She was seeing things, small things, a sauce too salty, a salad wilting in the corner, a rice served in excess, a piece of meat cut too early and lost to the heat. "There's a lot there that could have gone somewhere else," she said, almost in a whisper. Valentina leaned in a little. "Somewhere else? For people who are hungry?" The answer didn't sound like a speech. It sounded like a memory. Renato blew air through his nose, impatient. "Are you hearing this? She wants to teach cooking at a gala dinner." Leah finally raised her eyes to him. There was no anger, just a tired firmness, the kind that is born when no one expects anything from you anymore. "No, I'm just seeing what you throw away." The whole table lost its breath for a second. Valentina rested her elbows on the edge of the plate, watching the girl with an attention that wasn't pity nor empty curiosity. It was something else, almost respect. "Who taught you to look like that?" Leah took her time. The whole hall waited. "My mother," then the diner. Her voice came out low, but the name of the mother seemed to cross the whole table like a hidden thread pulling everything together. Valentina didn't ask anything more at that moment. She just made a small gesture for the waiter to come closer and, for the first time that night, no one argued. Leah remained seated in the same place, still not understanding why she hadn't been thrown out, still not trusting what was happening. But when the first new platter was placed in front of her, she realized that this night wouldn't end the way it started. Renato was still there, rigid, with the expression of someone who wouldn't accept losing ground in his own room. But Valentina had already changed the dynamic without apparent effort. One look from her was enough for the team around to understand that no one would touch Leah, nor speak to her as if she were a problem. The girl remained seated on the edge of the chair, her hands folded, observing everything around her, with an attention that didn't match the image everyone had of her until that moment. "My mother also said to look at what's left before complaining about what's missing," Leah said without raising her voice. Valentina tilted her face, interested. "And why did you do that?" Leah ran her tongue over her dry lips, thinking for a second. "Because food is someone's work. Throwing it away without thinking seems wrong." Renato let out a short, bitter laugh, as if that answer was irritating because it was too simple. "That's easy to say when you're not the one paying the bill." Leah slowly turned her face toward him. There was no fear there, just a kind of clean exhaustion, as if she had already heard worse versions of that same contempt. "I've seen people eating from the trash. It's not pretty." The phrase erased any trace of sarcasm from some guests' faces. The atmosphere became heavy again, and now it wasn't the weight of luxury, it was the weight of realizing that someone in front of them knew things that the whole table preferred to pretend didn't exist. Valentina remained still, her hand resting on the edge of the glass. Then she asked, without softening her voice, "Where do you sleep?" Leah took a while to answer. Not because she was making anything up, because choosing words there seemed like a risk. She looked around, saw the chandelier reflecting in the glass, saw the clock on the wall, saw a waiter pretending to align the silverware with a precision that no longer hid the discomfort. Tonight, if I can, anywhere it doesn't rain." The answer fell like a small stone, but deep. Renato clenched his teeth. "This isn't dinner conversation." "Then why are you listening?" Valentina cut in. He opened his mouth, closed it. The billionaire leaned toward Leah, and her voice came lower, but much more dangerous now because there was no judgment in it. "Are you really alone?" Leah put her hand on the table for a second, just enough to feel the firmness of the wood, as if she needed to remember that this was real. Then she answered without embellishment, "My mother died. The house went away after that." No one breathed properly. There was no crying, no breakdown, just that dry phrase, delivered like someone giving information, and for that reason, much heavier. Valentina didn't look away. Renato, for the first time, seemed not to know where to put his own body. Even the chefs at the back remained motionless. Leah continued, "I learned to cook at a diner after that. I learned to survive." The billionaire observed her face for a few seconds. There was no victimhood there, no plea for salvation. There was a whole story compressed into a few words. "And that's where you learned to notice a salt mistake?" Valentina asked. Leah nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Among other things." The phrase made one of the chefs look toward the kitchen with discomfort. Valentina followed the girl's gaze to the platter in the center of the table, then to the trays leaning on the side. She understood that Leah wasn't just seeing service flaws. She was seeing waste, routine, carelessness, things that for anyone there were luxury. For her, they were wasted hunger. Renato crossed his arms, trying to regain control. "All this is very sensitive, but it doesn't change the fact that she shouldn't be here." Valentina didn't even look at him. "So the problem is what she is or what she saw?" The question hung in the air without an answer. Leah lowered her eyes again, but now she didn't seem shrunk. She just seemed tired of being underestimated, and on that enormous table, surrounded by glasses, silverware, and people used to commanding, it was precisely she who made everyone realize that there was something wrong in the kitchen that night, something much bigger than a poorly served plate. Valentina stayed silent for a few seconds, just watching Leah, as if she were putting together an image that no one else there could see. The hall remained quiet, but now that silence had another weight. It was no longer contempt, it was attention. Even Renato seemed to have lost his breath, irritated by realizing he no longer controlled the scene. "You learned that alone?" the billionaire asked, without taking her eyes off the girl. Leah shrugged, almost in an automatic gesture. "I learned by watching. You learn fast when food is scarce." The answer made the air denser. One of the guests at the end of the table looked at his plate and pushed aside an almost entire portion without realizing he was doing exactly what Leah was criticizing. Valentina noticed, of course she noticed, and that's why her expression hardened even more. "Show me," she said. Leah blinked, surprised. "What?" "What you saw here." Renato let out a humorless laugh. "This has gone too far." But the billionaire didn't even move. "If she noticed something no one else noticed, I want to hear it." Leah looked at the platter, then at the plates around, then at the service counter, where the chefs had left part of the preparation ready. Her posture changed little, but the focus became evident. For the first time that night, she didn't seem to be at someone else's table. She seemed to be at the only place where she knew exactly what to do. "The meat was cut too early," she said, pointing lightly with her chin. "It lost heat. The rice is too heavy on butter, but without balance with the rest. And this salad, it was assembled now, but it's already wilting because it stayed near the light." One of the chefs widened his eyes. Leah continued without raising her voice. "The fish sauce is too salty, not by taste, by reduction error." Valentina turned her face toward the kitchen, and the silence became even more tense. One of the men in white lowered his head. Renato seemed offended, as if the very order of the night had been attacked. "You're hearing a stranger correct my dinner?" he shot. Valentina answered without looking at him. "I'm hearing someone pay attention." Leah didn't smile. She didn't seem interested in winning any argument. She just said what she saw. "And there's more. There's food stored the wrong way. You'll lose good things by the end of the night." Renato opened his mouth to retort, but Valentina raised a hand, and he stopped. The billionaire leaned forward, resting her fingers on the table, her eyes fixed on the girl. "Who taught you to look at waste like that?" Leah breathed deeply. The answer came after a short, heavy pause, as if she needed to cross an old door to speak. "My mother didn't leave leftovers without reason. After that, the diner taught me the rest." The words stayed between them like a fragile but true bridge. Valentina looked again at the nearly untouched plates, the trays too full, the team that until then served without thinking about what was left along the way, and maybe it was at that moment that she understood a simple and uncomfortable thing. Leah hadn't asked for leftovers because she didn't know how to ask for more. She had spoken because she recognized value where others saw scraps. Renato still tried to recover his presence, straightening his jacket and lowering his tone just a little. "That doesn't change the fact that she showed up here uninvited." Valentina slowly raised her eyes to him. "And did you notice that she saw the whole kitchen before sitting down?" He hesitated. "I noticed." "Then maybe the problem isn't her presence." Leah remained silent, but her fingers, hidden under the table, relaxed a little. Her face remained serious, her body still caught in the expectation of being sent away at any moment. Only now there was something different in the air. For the first time at that table, someone had looked at her without trying to reduce her existence to a nuisance. And when Valentina asked her name, Leah's answer came out almost in a whisper, but enough to change everything. "Leah." Valentina repeated the name in a low voice, as if testing the sound of it in her mouth. The word seemed small, in the face of all the tension accumulated at the table, but enough to change the posture of those nearby. Renato was still there. Still, his face closed, waiting for the moment when the billionaire would lose interest and send the girl away. Only that didn't happen. "Leah," Valentina said again, now firmer. "Stay." The girl looked up immediately, distrustful. Not of Valentina exactly, distrustful of the world. "Stay where?" "Here, until I finish understanding what happened to you." Renato let out a short, dry laugh. This turned into an interrogation. Valentina didn't even turn her face. It turned into attention. The answer was so simple, it left the man without reaction for a second. Leah still didn't know what to do with that. Her hands moved little, folded on her lap, as if her whole body remained ready to run at the smallest sign of change. But she didn't leave, and that, in itself, was already an answer. Valentina made a gesture, and one of the waiters approached with another platter. The warm smell of food rose in the air, and Leah understood at once that this had been prepared with too much care to be treated as leftovers. Her stomach tightened, not just from hunger, from fear too. When food enters the life of someone who has been without it for too long, the first feeling isn't gratitude, it's distrust. "Eat," said Valentina. Leah looked at the plate, then at the people around, as if waiting for the hidden trick. "Can I really?" "You can." Renato made an impatient movement. "Valentina, honestly, this is going to what?" She cut in, without raising her voice. "Going to ruin the night of someone who didn't even eat from their own plate?" The silence fell heavy again. Leah touched the fork with 2 fingers, hesitated, and then took a small portion. The gesture was contained, almost too cautious for someone who was hungry. She brought it to her mouth slowly, as if each movement needed to be authorized by the body before truly existing. The chewing came slowly, attentively, like someone who recognizes the flavor before believing in it. Valentina noticed that. And she noticed another thing too. Leah didn't eat like someone hungry by impulse. She ate like someone who knew how to give value to every bite. "Where did you learn to cook so early?" the billionaire asked. Leah swallowed before answering. "My mother made lunchboxes to sell. I helped. And after? After that, I became the girl who washed pots, cut onions, and cleaned the counter. The diner was small, but it was my world." The phrase came without drama, just with the naturalness of someone telling their own survival. Even so, something in it hit the whole table, because there was too much truth in that tone. It wasn't a made-up story to cause pity. It was life speaking in the most direct way possible. Renato crossed his arms. "And that gives you authority to correct a high-level chef?" Leah looked up, without rushing. "No. It gives me a memory." Valentina let the answer linger. Memory. That was more dangerous than opinion. Memory had smell, texture, context. Memory knew how to recognize when sugar was missing, when the pan was burning, when a good leaf was thrown away out of laziness. And, from her expression, the billionaire understood that Leah wasn't improvising a pretty speech. She was just describing what she had learned to see because she needed to survive by looking. "Do you live nearby?" Valentina asked. Leah almost let out a humorless laugh. "Today I live where I can." Renato made to intervene again, but the billionaire silenced him with a look so hard that he stepped back immediately. The whole hall seemed to breathe halfway. The night that had started as an elegant dinner was already completely off anyone's script. Leah took another piece of food, smaller than the first, and her eyes went down to the empty platter beside it. There was a consciousness on her face, a way of looking at leftovers with the same seriousness with which others analyzed contracts. Valentina saw that and didn't look away. "You didn't ask for food," she said. "You pointed out a problem." Leah wiped her mouth carefully. "Because a problem can be solved." Valentina stayed silent long enough for all present to understand. That conversation was no longer about who could or couldn't sit at that table. It was about everything that girl saw, and no one else had the courage to admit. And while the advisor remained still, increasingly out of control, the billionaire was already deciding that this night would go far beyond a served plate. Valentina looked at Leah with an attention that no longer had anything of superficial curiosity. Now there was calculation, listening, and a kind of silent decision happening there in front of everyone. Renato seemed to notice it too, because his jaw tightened and he shifted again in his chair, bothered by how the night had escaped his control. "You talk as if you see the kitchen from the inside," said Valentina. Leah shrugged, without vanity. "I see what's missing." "And what's missing here?" The girl looked at the platter, then at the chefs, then at the trays leaning against the wall. There was no arrogance in her eyes, just an almost painful objectivity. "There's a lack of respect for food." Renato let out a short laugh, but no one followed. Even he realized that his own voice no longer had the same weight. "Respect?" he repeated. "This is a gala dinner, not a community kitchen." Leah answered without raising her tone. "And waste is waste on any table." The phrase remained in the air like a sentence too simple to be contested. One of the women at the end of the table looked away to her own plate. Another adjusted her ring on her finger and remained silent. Valentina observed all of this and then asked, "Have you ever worked in a real kitchen besides the diner?" "Yes, where there was fire lit and people who were hungry." The answer drew almost no reaction, but enough to show that Leah wasn't stubborn out of pride. She spoke of what she knew, and what she knew came from hot floors, scraped pots, long shifts, and the smell of frying oil stuck to her clothes. Valentina made a discreet gesture for the waiter to remove the empty platters. Then she asked again, "And can you say what you would do differently here?" Leah placed her fingers on the edge of the table without invading, just marking her presence. I would separate what can still be served from what has already passed its point. Then I would review the portions. There are dishes that leave beautiful and come back almost intact. And there are ingredients that are being treated as luxury, but could become a meal for many people. Renato leaned forward, irritated. That's not a subject for someone who showed up here asking for leftovers. Leah faced him for the first time without lowering her eyes. I didn't ask for leftovers. I asked if I could eat what they were going to throw away. The comment made the whole hall stiffen, not out of aggression, out of precision. It was impossible to distort the phrase. Valentina understood this and placed her hand on the table, even firmer. He heard right then. Renato breathed deeply, trying to compose himself. Even so, that doesn't mean that she's right? Valentina cut in. The advisor fell silent. Leah lowered her eyes to her own plate again, but now with less tension in her body. There was still caution in every gesture, as if nothing there was guaranteed. And maybe it wasn't. What was happening didn't seem like a common invitation. It seemed like a crack opening in the middle of a closed life. Valentina observed the way the girl held her fork, how she chose the smaller pieces before taking the rest, as if she had learned to never advance too much when something good appeared. That hit her in an uncomfortable way, because there was dignity in that restraint, and there was a whole story hidden in that habit. "Leah," she said, using the name more naturally this time, "if I give you access to the kitchen, can you show me what you saw?" The girl took a second to respond. She looked at the hall, the plates, the attentive faces, and then back at Valentina. "I can." "Without fear of telling the truth?" "Especially because of that." The answer came firm enough to make some guests shift in their chairs. Renato opened his mouth, but gave up before starting. Valentina, for the first time, smiled slightly. It wasn't a party smile. It was recognition. "Then maybe you're not here by accident." Leah didn't respond. She just kept looking at the billionaire with the same distrust as before, mixed now with something new, the possibility that, on this night, someone was finally truly listening. Valentina didn't take her eyes off Leah. There was something about that girl that wasn't just hunger or courage. It was attention, a kind of reading of the world that is born when life forces someone to observe everything so as not to get lost. Renato remained seated, but now his discomfort was no longer concealable. The whole hall had also changed temperature, as if the night had begun to revolve around a single decision. "I want to understand one thing," said Valentina, resting her fingers on the table. "You saw all of this just by looking?" Leah breathed deeply before answering. "The eye gets used to it." "To what?" "To the error." The phrase came out short but hit deep. One of the chefs at the back of the room looked sideways, clearly bothered. Renato let out an impatient sigh. "This is very convenient. Now everyone has become an expert." Leah turned her face toward him without raising her tone. "Expert, no. Just tired of seeing good things become scraps." The billionaire realized that any attempt to provoke that girl would fail. Leah didn't react with empty defense. She responded with a kind of cruel economy of words, like someone who learned that talking too much can also waste energy. Valentina then signaled for one of the waiters to bring the kitchen menu, not the one from the table. The man hesitated for an instant, until he realized she wasn't joking. When the notebook arrived, Valentina opened it on the table and slid it toward Leah. "Show me where you would start." The girl lowered her eyes to the pages and ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the paper. The gesture was small, but full of care, as if a simple object still needed to be treated with respect so as not to disappear. "I would start with the exit of what's left over. There's a lot you're keeping just so you don't admit you got the count wrong." Renato moved his jaw, irritated. "You don't even know the flow of the house. But I know hunger. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was impact. Because for the first time since the beginning of the night, someone had named the true measure of that conversation. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't protocol. It was hunger. Valentina tilted her face and asked, "Do you still have family?" Leah remained still for a second. The whole hall seemed to hold its breath with her. When she answered, the voice came out clean, without drama. "Not like before." "And no one helped you?" "Some people tried. Others just watched." The billionaire perceived the difference in the sentence. Tried, watched. Two words that separated humanity from convenience. Renato, on the other hand, already seemed less willing to keep his own mask. "This is getting too sentimental," he murmured. Valentina didn't bother to answer. Instead, she closed the menu calmly and asked, "What do you know how to cook?" Leah raised her eyes to her for the first time with a little more confidence. "What feeds?" The answer made the whole room fall silent again. There was no pose, no desire to impress, just the truth of someone who learned early that food is more than a pretty plate. It's opportunity, it's permanence, it's shelter. Valentina leaned back slightly in her chair, analyzing the girl as if she were already seeing beyond that table. Maybe that was what bothered Renato more than anything. The billionaire had stopped seeing an intruder and started seeing someone too useful to be ignored. "And if I took you to my community kitchen tomorrow?" she asked. Leah blinked, surprised. "To do what?" "To see if you're right." Renato let out a brief, almost nervous laugh. "This is going to set a precedent." Valentina didn't even turn her face. "Let it." Leah looked at the platter, the plate, the leftovers that were still there, and then at the woman in front of her. There wasn't full trust yet, but there was already a crack, and it was in that crack that the night began to change definitively. Valentina closed the menu calmly and let the silence work for her. The whole table no longer seemed like a dinner table. It seemed like a kind of inverted judgment, where the girl who had arrived asking for what was left over was now the only person there capable of seeing what no one else saw. Leah remained seated with her hands together on her lap, still distrustful, but already without the same impulse to flee. Something in her had changed, even if only enough to stay and listen. "Early tomorrow," said Valentina, "you come with me." Leah frowned. "To the community kitchen." "To the community kitchen." Renato let out a dry laugh, as if the proposal was a tolerable deviation only until the billionaire got tired of the idea. "That's not going to work." Valentina didn't even look in his direction. "You already tried to stop too many things today." The phrase fell in the middle of the room, and no one moved. Leah looked at her own plate for a moment, then at the woman in front of her. The dinner had started with a humble and almost humiliating request, and now she was being called to enter a real kitchen. Her whole body seemed without instruction on how to react to this. It wasn't joy she felt. It was a quiet fear, mixed with the strange feeling that maybe life was opening a door without asking permission. "I don't have the right clothes," she said almost in a whisper. Valentina answered without rushing. "I have a team that handles that. I don't have documents. I handle that too." "And if I can't do it?" Valentina looked at her firmly without softening the truth. "Then you learn, like you learned to survive." The phrase hit hard because Leah couldn't deny it. Surviving had been her hardest school, and yet there was something new in the billionaire's tone. It wasn't pity. It wasn't performative charity. It was the insistence of someone who sees value before it becomes history. Renato crossed his arms. "You're turning an intruder into a project." Valentina finally looked at him. "No, I'm seeing a solution you tried to expel." A low murmur ran through the guests. No one there wanted to admit it, but they all realized that power had changed sides for a few minutes. Leah ran her fingers over the water glass without drinking, just feeling the coldness of the glass. The gesture was small, but it betrayed her state. Her body was still ready to retreat, while her head began to accept that maybe she no longer needed to live only in defense mode. The billionaire leaned in a little. "Tell me one thing, Leah. If you had access to the kitchen, what would you do first?" The girl stayed quiet for a few seconds. The whole hall seemed to lean with her, waiting for the answer. And when it came without embellishment. "I would look at what's going to the trash before the end of the shift. After, I would separate what still has value and what really has value. I would try to turn it into real food." Valentina smiled slightly, but there was real respect in that smile. "Real food!" Yes, Renato rolled his eyes, but the billionaire no longer needed to argue with him. "Tomorrow, you're going to show me that," she said. "Your way." Leah nodded, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't total acceptance. It was something more fragile and more precious, permission to try. And on that table that before seemed made only of distance, the night finally stopped being about leftovers. It became about chance. Valentina asked the team to prepare for the next morning, and for the first time that night, no one argued. The hall was still silent, but now it was a silence of waiting, not contempt. Leah remained seated, observing everything as if she still didn't believe she was being included instead of expelled. Her hands remained together on her lap, but her shoulders were no longer so rigid. There was still caution, yes. Only now there was also a crack of hope she was trying to hide. "You're coming with me early," said Valentina without taking her eyes off her, "and you're going to show me everything you saw." Leah nodded slowly. "Okay." Renato blew air through his nose, clearly bothered by the direction of the night. For him, that had already passed an acceptable limit a long time ago. Only, the more he tried to regain control, the more he realized he had lost the center of the conversation. The billionaire wasn't just being generous. She was making a decision. "If she shows up in the kitchen, the staff will talk," he said, trying to bring the discussion back to the cold logic of reputation and image. Valentina answered without altering her voice. "Then they'll learn to talk less and observe more." The phrase was short, but enough to close the subject. Leah looked at her face, trying to understand if that was a test, a trap, or simply the first real chance someone had given her in a long time. There was no way to know. But there was something in Valentina's tone that seemed different from everything she had ever heard from rich people. It wasn't a rushed favor. It was an open door with intention. "And if I make a mistake?" Leah asked, almost in a thread of a voice. Valentina stayed silent for a moment, as if the answer was too obvious. "Then we correct it." Leah felt her throat tighten, but kept her face firm. It wasn't easy to accept care after so long being treated as leftovers. Everything inside her still waited for the moment when someone would say again that she didn't belong to that place. But that didn't happen. Instead, the billionaire made a gesture to the waiter and asked that food be separated in proper packaging, without excess, without spectacle. "You're going to take something for tonight," said Valentina when the employee walked away. "And tomorrow, we talk again." Renato crossed his arms. "This is already becoming a kind of rescue." Valentina finally turned her face toward him, enough to silence any other attempt. "No, a rescue would be giving her something and calling it kindness. I am offering work." The word work hung in the air with a special weight. Leah didn't smile, didn't thank excessively, didn't get emotional in public. She just looked at the woman in front of her with a new attention, almost distrustful for how serious it was. It had been a long time since anyone used that word for her as a real possibility. It had always been survival, favor, deviation, charity. Work sounded different. It sounded like a place. "I can learn," said Leah. Valentina answered right away, "I know." It was at that moment that the whole hall seemed to realize that something important had just been decided. There was no applause, no announcement, no spectacle. Just a girl who arrived asking if she could eat what was left, and a billionaire who, instead of humiliating her, understood that the real leftover was the way everyone else was looking at her. And when the food arrived, wrapped, still warm, Leah held the bag carefully, as if she were receiving not leftovers, but the first concrete proof that this night had changed the direction of her life. That night ended without noise, but not without weight. Leah walked out carrying the bag with the warm food as if it were more fragile than glass. It wasn't just food. It was the first thing someone gave her without making a point of reminding her how much she didn't have. Outside, the street air hit cold on her face, and for a second hunger stopped being the center of everything. In its place came something else, a small, insistent, almost uncomfortable doubt. Was this real, or just another kindness that would end before dawn? Valentina walked her to the building entrance. She didn't ask a driver to intervene, didn't take a photo, didn't turn the moment into a scene. She just stood there, watching the girl adjust the bag against her chest. "Tomorrow at 7, she said. "No delays." Leah nodded. "I'll be there." Renato, standing one step behind, seemed more and more out of place. There was nothing left he could say without seeming small. He had tried to expel the girl, frame her, reduce her presence to a nuisance too clean for that room. And now the same girl walked out the main door with an address, an opportunity, and a dignity he hadn't been able to take away. When Valentina's car passed, and the interior lights illuminated Leah's face for a second, the billionaire noticed something she hadn't seen before. The girl was tired in a very old way. It wasn't just exhaustion from a bad night. It was the tiredness of someone who had already been left behind many times, and who, even so, still kept precision in her gaze. Precision for food, for gesture, for silence. "You're going to eat first," said Valentina, almost like an order. Leah looked at her, slightly surprised. "Then I'll sleep," the billionaire continued, "and tomorrow you'll show me what you know." The girl hesitated a little, squeezing the bag. "And if I don't know enough?" Valentina answered without raising her voice. "You already knew enough to make everyone at that table shut up." Leah let out almost a smile, but it faded fast. It was hard to trust rest when the street still called her name every night. Even so, she gave a short nod and started walking. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She just kept going with the food in her hands, and her body trying to learn a feeling that hadn't come with her for a long time. The feeling of having somewhere to return to. At the table inside, the atmosphere was no longer the same. The guests spoke quietly, some uncomfortable, others clearly affected by what they had just seen. The dinner had lost its pose and gained truth. And Valentina, looking at the street through the open door for another moment, understood that the decision made there went far beyond an offered meal. She had chosen to see a girl that the whole world preferred to ignore. The next day, the community kitchen wouldn't be just a workspace. It would be the beginning of a new version of Leah. A version that didn't need to ask for leftovers to prove she deserved to exist. Leah slept little. The improvised room that Valentina had prepared for her still seemed too big, too silent, too clean. For a while, the girl sat on the edge of the bed, the empty bag beside her, listening to her own breathing, as if she needed to confirm that this place really existed. Every time she closed her eyes, the street came, the rain came, the empty stomach came. And every time she opened them, she found the clean sheet, the soft light, and the strange feeling that someone had finally decided not to throw her out. In the community kitchen the next day, everything was movement. Pots, low voices, the smell of garlic, broth, and vegetables in the air. Leah walked in with careful steps, still not knowing exactly where to put her hands or her gaze. Valentina was already there, her hair tied up, her sleeve rolled up, with no sign that this was a facade gesture. Her presence changed the atmosphere without needing to announce anything, and that by itself made advisor Renato feel even smaller. "She really came," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Valentina didn't even turn around." "I said she would." Leah scanned the whole kitchen with her eyes, absorbing everything at once: the cold counter, the labels on the boxes, the steam rising from the pots, the smell of food that wasn't there to impress anyone, but to nourish. It was almost painful to realize how much that place functioned without luxury, and yet with more truth than the hall where she had been treated as an intruder. Her body reacted before her mind. Her shoulders began to lower slowly. Her breathing became less held. Her hands stopped looking for an exit. "Stay here with me," said Valentina, pointing to an empty station. "I want you to watch first." Leah nodded. The chef observed with caution, not knowing if he should speak. Renato crossed his arms, clearly expecting some mistake that would justify his distrust. But Leah just stood still for a few seconds, looking at the production like someone reading an old text and recognizing the language. She touched lightly a tray of cut vegetables, turned her face toward the sauce pot, observed the amount of rice ready, analyzed the position of the pots and the flow of people. There was no rush, there was reading, and Valentina noticed that with more force than before. The girl wasn't improvising an opinion, she was building a map. "Here you waste time on this assembly," Leah said finally, pointing with her chin to a part of the counter, "and this broth will dry out if no one stirs it sooner." The chef raised an eyebrow. "And you know that just by looking?" "I know because the edge is already forming a film." Valentina turned her face toward the indicated pot. The responsible man went to check right away and came back a little embarrassed because Leah was right. A small detail, but enough to open a crack in everyone's respect. Renato let out an irritated sound. "Even so, she doesn't know the standards of the house." Leah looked at him without hostility. "Then teach me." The answer remained in the air, like a displaced piece on the chessboard. Renato expected resistance, pride, maybe an explosion. Not this calm, not this willingness to learn without diminishing herself. Valentina smiled just from the corner of her mouth, almost imperceptibly, and handed Leah a clean apron. "Put it on." The girl took the fabric carefully. The gesture seemed simple, but for her it had the weight of a right. When she tied the apron around her waist, something in her posture changed a little. Not enough to transform everything at once, but enough to mark a beginning. The advisor saw that and understood, with growing discomfort, that the girl he had tried to expel was now inside the kitchen, watching like a future important piece of the place. And while the steam rose and the dishes began to come out, Leah understood that work wasn't a favor. It was the first proof of trust someone gave her without asking her to shrink in return. Valentina wanted to observe without interfering, and for that reason she let Leah work in peace for a few minutes. The kitchen had its own rhythm, a type of collective breathing that only makes sense when everyone knows the weight of what they're doing. Leah felt that fast, not because she had studied at a fancy place, but because for years she had observed kitchens like someone observing a shelter. The smell of garlic in butter, the steam trapped in the glass, the metallic sound of spoons, everything there seemed less glamorous than the hall from the night before, but much more honest. She approached the first counter and ran through a preparation list with her eyes, without yet touching anything. Valentina saw her caution before any comment. Leah didn't advance by impulse. She measured, compared, thought. The advisor, leaning near the door, followed every movement with a frown, expecting reality to correct the arrogance of the night before. But what he saw was the opposite. The more Leah looked, the more precise she became. "There's an excess here," she said, pointing to the ready portions. "You're going to lose texture if this waits until the end of the shift." The responsible chef approached, distrustful. Can you say that just by appearance? By the color, by the amount of steam, by the way the edge is drying? Valentina didn't interrupt. She wanted to see how far the girl's reading would go. Leah moved to the next station and evaluated the sauce, the vegetables, the cooking point, the separation between what could still be served and what was beginning to lose value. There was something almost uncomfortable in her precision. It wasn't a pose. It was a memory of need. "This potato has already passed the ideal point," she continued. "And if you mix it now, the whole dish loses." One of the cooks bit the inside of his cheek, offended and surprised at the same time. "And where did you study?" he asked. Leah finally looked at him. "Nowhere you would call a class." The answer was dry enough to silence curiosity with respect. Valentina noticed an important detail at that moment. Leah wasn't trying to seem superior. She spoke of what she knew because she needed to make every second of her own story count. And that changed everything. Kitchen work for her wasn't aesthetics, it was organized survival. Renato stepped forward, no longer hiding his irritation. "This here isn't just intuition. There are standards, processes. You can't just walk in and think you know more than the team." Leah wiped her hands on her apron before answering. "I'm not thinking. I'm seeing." Silence. Short. Heavy. Definitive. Valentina crossed her arms and observed the faces of the employees. One by one they began to change the way they looked at the girl. It was no longer pure distrust. It was a mix of surprise and discomfort, because it was becoming impossible to deny that Leah saw flaws they had normalized, and normalizing a flaw was a luxury that Kitchen could no longer afford. "Test her," said Valentina finally, looking at the chef. "How?" "Put her on the next plate with you." The man hesitated only a second. Leah lowered her eyes, tightened the strap of her apron, and stepped toward the counter. There was no triumph on her face, just concentration. She knew that an opportunity like that could disappear at the first hesitation. So she stayed whole there, with her body, with her gaze, with the memory of everything she had learned when she still needed to take advantage of every leftover to survive. And in that moment, the community kitchen stopped being the place where she would start from the bottom. It became the place where she could finally show she had never been beneath anything. Valentina made a gesture to the chef, and the man, still distrustful, brought the next assembly from the station with a closed expression. Leah breathed deeply before touching the ingredients. The noise of the kitchen continued around her, pots clanging, water boiling, short orders crossing the air. But inside her, everything seemed to have lowered its volume. It was as if that counter had become the only real place in the whole kitchen. "Show me how you finalize this," she asked without challenging, just asking for space to understand. The chef indicated the order of movements, and Leah followed each step with her eyes before repeating. She didn't speed up. She didn't want to impress. She just did. She adjusted the amount of sauce, corrected the balance of the dish, repositioned the elements with a precision that made the man slowly raise his head. Valentina perceived the exact moment when the doubt on his face began to give way to something else. More uncomfortable. Respect. Renato saw it too and pressed his arms against his body. "This could be a coincidence," he let out. Leah didn't turn toward him. "Coincidence doesn't know the right cooking point." The answer was so clean it drew a brief silence even from those working nearby. Valentina almost smiled, not for the irony, but for the way Leah defended herself without diminishing herself. There was in her a quiet firmness, the type of strength that is born from someone who could never afford to waste energy on theater. The chef took the assembly she had just adjusted and carried it to the pass-through window. He came back seconds later with a less hard face. "It's better," he admitted. Leah let the air out slowly, as if only now allowing her body to understand she hadn't done wrong. Valentina observed that, with doubled attention. The girl didn't celebrate. She didn't raise her chin, didn't seek approval. She just stood there, waiting for the next task. That detail said more than any speech. Leah wanted to belong, but not by favor, by value. "Do it again," said the billionaire. Leah looked up. "You want me to repeat it?" "I want to see consistency." The girl nodded and went back to work. From then on, the atmosphere began to change in an almost invisible way. The employees began to observe her with less resistance. The chef already responded to her questions more directly, and even Renato seemed to realize he was losing ground in a territory he thought he dominated. The whole kitchen was beginning to recognize what Valentina had already understood the night before. That girl didn't need pity. She needed a chance. Leah assembled the plate a second time, corrected a small flaw in the finish, adjusted a detail in the color contrast, and then stepped back to evaluate the result with the same critical eye as before. Valentina saw her posture change just a little, enough to perceive that something inside that girl was aligning with the present. When the plate went out through the window, the chef came back with the answer almost immediately: approved. Renato lowered his eyes for a second, too irritated to hide it, but there wasn't much he could do anymore. The girl he had tried to remove from the door was now solving flaws in front of the whole team, and, that morning, the community kitchen began to learn to look at Leah the right way, not as someone being brought in, but as someone who already knew exactly where to step. Valentina watched Leah solve another station without hesitating. The way the girl saw every detail was beginning to alter the mood of the whole kitchen. It was no longer just a curiosity from the day before. It was real, concrete competence, impossible to deny. The chef, who before kept his arms rigid and his gaze closed, now spoke to her in a lower tone, almost testing his own confidence in what he was seeing. "This leftover here can still be used," said Leah, pointing to a side pot. "If you separate it now, you preserve the flavor and avoid waste." The man leaned in to check. "You notice that from where?" "From someone who already counted piece by piece what they had at home." The answer came without drama, but with a force that made Valentina look at her in another way once again. It was clear that Leah wasn't speaking theory. She was speaking of days when every ingredient counted, of moments when losing food meant losing dinner, of nights when the simple act of eating already seemed like a distant luxury. Everything there was born from that, and maybe that's why her reading was so precise. Renato approached, unable to stay quiet much longer. "This is impressive, but it doesn't change that she came in here without a reference, without registration, without formal training," Valentina answered without turning her face. "And yet she's already seen more flaws than half the team." Renato closed his mouth for a moment. Leah heard, but didn't react. Her reaction was always the same when someone tried to put her back in the place she had come from. Silence first, firmness after. She took a ladle, stirred the broth at the exact point, and looked at the shine of the surface with attention. The gesture was so simple, it almost went unnoticed. But it didn't. The chef observed, the assistants followed, and the billionaire understood that respect came precisely from that simplicity without vanity. "You know how to work with little," said Valentina, more to state than to ask. Leah looked up, still focused. "I learned not to waste what I can't replace." The phrase silenced the kitchen for a whole second. There was no applause, no big reaction, just a change in atmosphere. Because everyone there understood in their own way that skill hadn't been born in an expensive course, nor in a gastronomy lab. It had been born in the limit, and the limit teaches fast. The chef approached again, now with another tone. "Do the next assembly with us. Leah nodded and entered the flow without asking permission. This time no one observed her as a test. They observed her as someone who, in a few hours, had changed the logic of the environment. Valentina understood that, and let the scene unfold without interfering. It was important that the kitchen see for itself, important that Renato see too, because there was no longer any way to pretend Leah's presence was a mistake. When the new plate went to the pass and came back approved again, the advisor's face closed for good. He no longer had an argument to sustain the attempt to push her away. And Leah, still with her hands busy and her gaze attentive, was beginning to occupy that space with the naturalness of someone who had finally found a door that didn't close in her face. Valentina saw the advisor lose the rest of his posture while Leah continued working as if nothing around mattered more than the next plate. The kitchen hall had already changed its atmosphere for a while, and now it was impossible to hide. The employees talked less, paid more attention, and even the most rushed movements seemed to adjust their rhythm to accompany her presence. The girl who had arrived asking if she could eat leftovers was, in front of everyone, transforming waste into decision. "You don't stop noticing what's missing," said Valentina, looking at Leah closely. Leah wiped her hands on her apron before answering. "Because I know what happens when things are missing." The billionaire held her gaze. "And what happens?" "The person learns not to throw anything away, not food, not opportunity." The answer made the silence spread in a different way. It wasn't the silence of embarrassment from the night before. It was the silence of someone who realizes they have heard something too true to pretend it didn't touch them. Renato clenched his jaw, clearly without finding more space to contest what was in front of him. He had tried to reduce Leah to an intruder, but now he saw the whole kitchen leaning toward her. "That doesn't mean she's ready to lead anyone," he said, more out of pride than conviction. Leah didn't argue. She just turned her face to the chef and waited for the next direction. That patience in her, mixed with the precision in her gaze, was beginning to gain weight within the team. There was no arrogance, no rush to prove superiority. There was a type of firmness that only appears in those who survived without an audience. Valentina understood that this was the exact moment of the turn, not just for the kitchen, for the girl's life. "She's not going to lead today," said the billionaire. "She's going to learn what she still needs to learn." Leah nodded immediately, without wounded pride. That also said a lot. She didn't want to be treated as a miracle, nor as a social project. She wanted a real place, a real path, and she was willing to start wherever necessary. The chef pointed to a new assembly sequence, and Leah followed everything without missing a single instruction. When she asked to adjust the cooking of a sauce and suggested a redistribution of tasks to avoid delay, the man just looked at Valentina. She answered with a short nod. It made sense. Deep down, she had already understood that it wasn't about giving space out of kindness. It was about recognizing the value that was being delivered in front of her. Renato, for his part, no longer seemed just upset. He seemed embarrassed, the type of shame that comes when someone realizes too late that they confuse status with competence. And it was at that moment that Valentina decided to make the change public. It wasn't enough to keep Leah inside. It was necessary to show everyone what she represented. "After the shift," said the billionaire, "I want you in the main room." The chef frowned. "You're going to talk to the team?" "I'm going to present who solved half of what you yourselves hadn't even seen." Leah looked up immediately, surprised. Valentina continued, like someone closing a cycle that had begun at dinner the night before and now needed to be concluded the right way. "You're not going to be hidden in here." Leah swallowed hard, not answering right away. There was fear on her face, yes, but not fear of work. Fear of appearing, of being truly seen, of having her own name placed in a place that before seemed forbidden. Even so, she stayed. She finished the station, adjusted the last detail, And when the plate went out once more perfect, the whole kitchen already knew. The girl who asked for leftovers had just gained in front of everyone something much bigger than food. She had gained belonging. After the shift, Valentina gathered the team in the main room and made sure to call Leah to stand by her side. The atmosphere was silent before she even opened her mouth. Renato already seemed uncomfortable just imagining what was coming, and the chefs, who until then had observed everything with caution, now waited for an explanation that would change the tone of the whole house. Valentina looked at everyone and spoke without rushing. "Last night, this girl walked in here asking if she could eat what was left. Today, she showed that she saw more of our kitchen than many people who have worked here for years." No one interrupted. Leah remained still, her hands crossed in front of her body, not knowing exactly where to place her own breathing. Valentina continued, "Her name is Leah, and from today on, she is part of the team." The silence that followed was different from anything Leah had ever lived. It wasn't rejection, it wasn't pity, it was recognition. Some employees exchanged discreet looks, others lowered their heads, perhaps embarrassed by the way they had looked at her at the beginning. Renato clenched his jaw, clearly humiliated by his own attempt to expel her. And it was precisely that which made the moment so strong. There was no scandal, just truth. Leah didn't smile right away. First she breathed deeply, then she looked at the billionaire as if she needed to confirm that this wasn't a dream about to dissolve. "I'm going to do it right," she said, her voice low but firm. Valentina nodded. "I know." In the days that followed, the change became impossible to hide. Leah learned the kitchen flows, improved dish assembly, reorganized simple processes, and began to suggest ways to better use ingredients without losing quality. What was once leftovers began to become real meals for many people, and little by little, the community kitchen stopped being just an image project and became a living, useful, and respected space. Renato tried to keep his distance, but reality reached him in every hallway. The girl he had treated with contempt began to be called by the cooks to solve practical problems, and Valentina herself made sure to include her in decisions. His embarrassment grew in the same proportion as trust in her increased. In the end, he couldn't sustain the pose in the face of something so evident. One day, weeks later, Valentina arrived at an institution event and saw Leah in an apron, guiding two employees with calm and precision. She wasn't in the center by favor. She was there because she had earned it. When the guests arrived, the billionaire made sure to introduce her naturally. "This is Leah, an essential part of our kitchen." The phrase crossed the room with force. The same environment that one day almost expelled her now had to face the opposite. The girl who asked for leftovers had become someone indispensable. And that's where the story closed the right way. Because it became clear that true generosity doesn't humiliate. True generosity sees, welcomes, and returns dignity. Leah didn't need pity. She needed a chance. And Valentina understood that before it was too late. I want to know, comment just ground down here, if you've ever been judged by your clothes, but proved with results. Or root, if you're going through this now. Tell me also where you're speaking from. Interior of Goiás, Mato Grosso, Ceará. Because this story is for everyone who truly understands the land. If this story touched you, share it now with that friend who judges by appearance, or with the one who needs to remember that results speak louder than any beautiful plate. They'll thank you later. And subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, because there are more stories like this coming of people no one bet on, but who changed everything with what they carried inside. You won't want to miss those, right? I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for staying this far with me.